Well, our ticket is Flirt for Honi. My name is Simone, and I'm in my third year of studying Arts and Advanced Studies, majoring in History and International Relations.
My name is Ariana. I'm in my third year studying Arts and Law, majoring in English. And you want to know the ticket, the members of our ticket?
Yep. So we have Aiden, Zena, Hamani, Sandra, Valerie, Amelia, May, and us too.
Why are you running for Honi?
So we're both incredibly passionate about student journalism. Our ticket is a ticket of incredibly passionate, talented writers who believe in creating an informed student body and kind of expanding their love for Honi and for writing to the broader community. Ariana and I are both, everyone on our ticket is incredibly experienced, and we have a lot of big visions for the year ahead. Do you want to say anything?
I think also in a sense, obviously it's a very rewarding experience to be able to edit. You get a lot of, power and autonomy to do things with the paper that you don't really get to do in other media. But I also think it's a form of giving back. Like I've had speaking personally, a really good experience writing for Honi since the beginning of first year. And I know that that's something that many students aren't afforded because they don't know about Honi when they first get to campus. But it really coloured my experience in a really positive way. And I think I really want to give back, and our whole ticket wants to do that and give people similar opportunities to write the way that we did and learn about themselves and learn about uni.
What does Honi's radical history mean, and what does continuing it look like in practice?
So Honi was first published in 1929 as a reaction against students' characterization in mainstream media as rambunctious and kind of off the beaten track. And so I think, in terms of imbuing that radical legacy, we are a space for students and student interests. Honi has had a radical left-wing and activist legacy, whether it be from protesting the Vietnam War to more kind of current iterations of that seen in climate protests, First Nations justice. And so I think our ticket has a really strong understanding of that history and a real vision to kind of push it forward.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, as Simone illustrated, Honi sets itself apart from other forms of media, and I think all student media has that in common. But Honi, thanks to its legacy and thanks to the resources it's afforded, can sort of really build on that and platform student voices in a really important way. So I think we want to keep going with that, and in no sense deter from that really important drive to stand apart from mainstream media and perhaps mainstream narratives that neglect the truth to students or other marginalized people in society.
Do you think Honi should publish articles with wider popular appeal, say on pop culture or sport, even if they lack a left-wing political angle?
That's a good question.
It's a good question.
Can I chat a little bit? Yeah. I'm finding that one hard to conceptualize only because I'm thinking about what it means to have a pop culture article that's missing a left-wing angle. I'm trying to imagine what that could be. Because I think obviously it's very important that Honi reports on culture. I think culture is a really important part. It's a way for students to navigate their own feelings about the world. I know Caitlin wrote a great piece recently on the Matildas, and I think that really spoke to a lot of people on campus and off campus. So I'm trying to picture something which potentially doesn't have a strong left-wing narrative. I think obviously we would take a discretionary approach, but I think some questions we would apply to it when deciding whether to publish is would this be seen in mainstream media? Obviously some things we publish will overlap with that, but would this be a mainstream narrative that could go elsewhere, or is this something that Honi is uniquely placed to publish? I think that's a good question to apply to it. And how is this helping students? When something doesn't have a strong left-wing narrative, I don't know if that means that it's something that could potentially harm students on campus, and we would never ever publish something like that because that is our priority first and foremost. So I think it's just about protecting students on campus who are attacked every day by the mainstream media, and making sure that our Honi reflects like the importance of that. But also balancing that with, the importance of cultural pieces.
Yeah.
But I think largely, like, a left-wing position is infused everywhere in the paper, from news to comedy and everything in between.
Yeah, agreed.
How would you get new readers to engage with Honi?
Yeah, so obviously our policy platforms are a lot of first-year engagement and kind of more outreach to new writers and readers. I think the current team has done a really good job recently setting up seminars and mentorships. Even Honi Hangouts every week are a really great way to do that. I think also kind of making the paper something that people want to read and something that people want to look at every week. Like, it might be that it's particularly eye-catching on Eastern Avenue, and so new readers want to pick it up. I think the current, it probably has always been like this. It might, continue to be like this, but there's a lot of confusion around kind of writing for Honi, who can write for Honi, how you write for Honi. So I think kind of demystifying that is kind of a big part of our platform. Did you have anything to add?
No, definitely. I think demystifying how to write for Honi and who can write for Honi, that can take place in a number of ways. Like, we'll engage closely with the collectives.
Yeah.
And like particularly, when we work on things such as women's Honi and queer Honi, like engaging those collectives for a long time with the paper, like more long term.
After the
then also clubs and societies at the uni, we can collaborate with them. Like, these are just some practical ways to enact sort of the vision that we have for engaging more students. But I think that, like, firstly, also we have to sit down as a team and we have analysed sort of why students aren't, like, why there is at times low outreach. And I think, some students don't know what Honi is, but also some students don't think they're good enough for Honi, which doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Some students who may not study English, for example, don't think that it's a place for them, which is also very much not true. So I think that even just like, there are 9 of us, we all, in our times at uni, have developed, like, contacts and networks, just using them as much as possible and making it really clear it's a welcoming space.
Yeah, a safe and comfortable space for new writers.
What is the biggest issue facing students at the moment?
Great question. I think there are a multiplicity of huge issues facing students. I think that it will depend which faculty the student's in, what their cultural background is. I know for me personally, the course cuts are particularly concerning. I think that, particularly the honours cuts recently and kind of the degree amalgamations, the faculty amalgamations, I think that that's concerning. I think it homogenises kind of what students are able to study, and it limits their study options. So that's my concern as an arts student. I think more broadly, if we're talking about current political issues, I think that climate change is obviously a huge thing. Our ticket is firmly climate activist ticket. I think also in the lead up, to the Yes campaign, to the referendum, running a critical Yes campaign is important.
I think that there are big issues that affect every single person on campus, such as course cuts or the corporatization of the university, or the fact that staff conditions are bad, which affects student learning conditions. And then I think every student carries with them their own experience in the world, but it is uni's place to make sure that those are accommodated for and cared for, such as the cost of living crisis, and then things that may affect students in particular pockets of society. So I think overall, number one, there's this big focus on education and attacks on higher ed, but I think it's impossible to say that there's just one issue that affects students.
I suppose it boils down to holding university management to account, whether that be through course cuts, whether it be through conditions for international students or student accommodation and the cost of living crisis. They're kind of the main issues affecting students here at this university.
Okay. A couple questions about the election. So, you've been provisionally elected uncontested. This is the 3rd time it's happened in the past 4 years. So, do you see this as a good thing for the health of Honi?
That's a really good question. I think that Honi has a history of contest, and that's what sets it apart from other student media, and that's really important and really good. I think that it's obviously striking a balance between contests which are productive and healthy, and I think there obviously are some reasons why Honi hasn't been contested recently that we can sort of work to address, and I think that sort of, steps alongside some of our policies about increasing outreach, because you can't have people running for Honi if they haven't
no one's
ridden for
riding.
Honi,
Yeah.
and if they don't feel empowered to do so.
Yeah.
But I think largely, the health of Honi is sort of beholden to like rigorous checks and balances on what the student population want from Honi. Like we saw in the 2021 election, there was an unprecedented number of votes, in general for who Honi should be, like who should be running for Honi. And I thought, although obviously like that an election is tough for those involved, I think that was a really good thing in terms of like more people were hearing about what it was. It was during COVID, so then like post-COVID, like people, like Honi was fresh in their mind. There were more votes for Honi than there were for the president. So I think that generally contests are important, but I think that contests have to be productive, and for that to be possible, people need to be writing for Honi and putting themselves out there. And also knowing that, like, if we can sort of alter and cultivate a welcoming atmosphere and culture, that contests can be done without fear of like, interpersonal attacks or something like that. That contests can be done and people can just put themselves forward and talk about what they believe is best for the paper, and it's up to the students to decide what they think.
Do you still feel as though you have a mandate from students?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all of the people on our ticket are experienced enough that they have responded in their writing and in their work to the needs of students. They've reflected kind of what the big issues are on campus over the last 2 to 3 years. I think that, we still have a mandate in the sense that we are working for the students. We are involved students ourselves in a lot of different areas of society, whether it be SUDS, SRC, clubs and societies. We have a broad range of different student experiences, and we receive positive feedback on our work regularly.
I also think another thing that speaks to the fact that we have a mandate, like we receive student money, and therefore we want to make an Honi that is reflective of student interests and like student interests that prioritize like our left-wing values. I think that there are ways for us to be held accountable and for Honi to be held accountable that are separate to an election, and those are really important to consider as well. Even just like, like excusing trolls and stuff, like think of like Facebook comment sections and letters to the editor. Like I think there are ways in which we have a mandate and we're responsible to students that like, might not be exhibited through an election, but exhibited throughout the course of our term. And as a ticket, we really want to be responding to students as much as possible.
Okay, and last one, do you think that, I guess in the absence of an election process that will normally bind a ticket together, how will you prepare for the rigours of editing Honi as a team of 9?
Yeah. I think we've kind of already begun that process because we thought we were going to be contested until very recently. And so we kind of have already gone through that a little bit in terms of role delegations, talking openly about our visions for Honi, about our workload capacities, reaching out interpersonally to talk about how we're feeling, how we're kind of like going with everything. I think that will probably be cemented more as we near taking office. But I think that so far we've established great personal connections and have a good understanding of where everyone's strengths lie in the team.
And I think also in terms of formulating our political vision together and how we would,
And building
like
the
we can
ticket,
probably anticipate, certain questions we may need to ask, certain like articles we might need to question whether or not we accept them. So I think it's all about having those discussions early, which we will do.
And we have already.
Begun.
Yeah.
And I think just keeping on having open, like we'll have more meetups, even messages in the chat, just ways to constantly like interrogate each other and also be friendly.
Yeah.
Cool. So building on that, what do you see as the biggest area of improvement when looking at Honi's recent history, and how do you plan on addressing it?
In terms of areas for improvement in recent years, there are, I think one really big one is one that is like obviously drawn straight from the fact that we were all in lockdown, and that there was like particularly low levels of outreach during COVID times. And so I think that like that speaks to what we were talking about before about outreach and making sure people know about Honi and feel empowered to write about it, because most people who are on campus, most students who are on campus and right now, or many of them weren't actually on campus in a pre-COVID uni, so they don't really understand neither were we, so we didn't fully understand like the extent of campus culture, what it was like beforehand, and I think sort of trying to return to that as much as possible and communicate that through Honi and making sure we have that outreach.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of also extends to another issue, which is like at times a paucity of interaction between Honi and other student papers.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
Which I don't think is a issue per se, but more I think a big area for improvement. Like there's huge scope for collaboration.
Yeah.
We're all fighting the same fight. Like if you open any student newspaper, they're all writing about the same issues that are affecting students. Perhaps with like qualified by different laws in different states. But I think that we need to be doing a lot more resource sharing, a lot more like even just like idea sharing, because if like our marketplace of ideas right now is just like limited to UCM and it can be so much more expanded. So I think that would be like it's been hard recently for tickets, and I think every ticket has made strides since COVID to increasing it. But I think just like increasing it even more.
Yeah, and I think even on campus, kind of really Honi's relationship with other student publications, in particular Pulp, creating more avenues for communication between us, like our two teams. I think also in terms of where the place of culture and perspective is in Honi, like obviously it has a huge place in Honi, but kind of finding its place alongside a publication like Pulp, which is still relatively new and like burgeoning.
And that's a new hurdle to tackle.
Yeah.
Cool. So moving on to looking at your team, especially the members. So 2 of your members, Ariana Haghighi and Amelia Rains, unsuccessfully ran with Drip for Honi. How does Flirt's vision differ from Drip's?
I might speak to this one.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great question, and I think that firstly and foremost, we don't want it to seem like Flirt is some sort of like offshoot of Drip, and I don't think it is. If you have a look at our policies, if you have a look at Drip's, I think it's important to note also that Drip and Flirt came about at very different times. Like so much changes at uni every year, and as Simone already spoke about, Pulp didn't exist in its current form as a magazine when Drip was around. So I think Drip had a strong vision to sort of fill that niche that was lacking with sort of having a design forward paper with a bit more like with cultural pictures that were a little bit different to the sort of culture that Honi receives, like a little bit more niche and like perhaps like had a less wide appeal than some of the pictures of the cultural pictures for Honi. So I think that was, and also like a strong focus on multimedia videos, and that is obviously part of our vision, but I think cognizant of the fact now that Pulp can handle that and sort of fill that niche for students who are interested, Flirt's vision is focusing also a lot more on news coverage and coverage of news and analysis across universities and across campuses, which is not something that Drip considered as much. I think just based on sort of what we needed, like what uni needed at the time.
Following on to that, only a handful of your members have news or analysis or investigation experience. How do you plan on ensuring good news and investigative coverage is continued?
Yeah, well I think that because we have that expertise maybe concentrated in certain parts of the ticket, there is an opportunity for sharing of that knowledge and therefore for interpersonal growth and the building of like stronger connections between us. So I think knowledge sharing within the ticket is really important. I also think that potentially knowledge sharing with past tickets and past editors would be really productive. There's a wealth of expertise in your team, in the teams that have come before you, which we'd really like to tap into. Also, I guess, in terms of news and analysis coverage, I think part of our platform and our policy is that the relationship between editors and their writers should never be transactional. And so I think part of that is acknowledging that we have a lot to learn from our writers who maybe are particularly interested in that area or have a lot of experience in that area. And so I think that would be a really great way to establish, again, like stronger interpersonal connections.
And I think that everyone on our ticket has a commitment to covering news, and I think news in a sense should be demystified, with resource sharing and learning from each other. It's not something that anyone is incapable of doing, and that's something like we want, first year writers to be covering news, so of course as editors we have the resources and the equipment to do that, all of us as well. Yeah.
What are some aspects of university and student life that you think you would want to investigate into?
Good question. I think there are some important projects that have occurred across the year that we would want to keep tabs on.
Yeah.
For example, looking at UCID's links to fossil fuel companies,
Thales
financial
in
links.
particular.
I know
Yeah.
that they're opening up spaces potentially in Wentworth building for Thales, and
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah,
Thales,
yeah.
and so I think like as that happens, keeping tabs on that, investigating that.
Yeah.
There are also, I mean, just minor things I can speak to that
Yeah.
have been
Yeah,
on
yeah.
my mind. I think that there are just like certain, like any choices on campus that have been made with regards to buildings, so just making sure we question why.
Like the Fisher roof.
Yeah, like why certain
Yeah.
why certain buildings have been done.
Yeah.
I think also there are some like interesting minor issues within faculties. I know that recently like the Global Citizenship Award has been discontinued. Like just basically and questioning why anything at uni happens. And you know, like there might not be a sinister reason for everything, but I think that you never know until you look into it, and it
Yeah.
is our mandate to look into everything we see. So I think just like using all of the links we have on campus and like, you know, looking at anything from like why reviews are dying, USU funding for different things, like SAF
Yeah.
allocation. I think just like investigating how all these processes occur.
Yeah,
And
and
do you
talking to
have any
students.
advice?
Yeah, talking to students I think is where, like, because we don't know what's going to come up until it comes up, you know, and we would love for people to bring those issues to us, either for them to write about them or for us to kind of work with them to investigate and analyse those kind of issues. So yeah, we really want.
Ooh, and another one, sorry, just before we forget.
No, yeah.
I think obviously there are some areas of campus that we have our eyes turned to. One of those is the colleges.
So
and
true.
also like international student housing for different reasons.
Yes.
But just like obviously we have certain areas that we've got our eyes and ears
Yes.
peeled. And
Finding
because
news.
we know that so much occurs at the colleges that is under wraps that
Yeah.
I feel like peeling off one layer
Yeah.
will reveal a lot.
Expose everything. Yeah.
One of your ticket members, Amelia Rains, has only written one article in the last 2 years. Do you think this is demonstrative of a commitment to the paper?
Do you want to take this? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the same opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's hard to speak on Amelia's behalf, but we'll do our best. Look, Amelia's been writing since 2019.
Yeah.
She wrote many articles, or quite a few in 2019. And so I think that makes her one of the only people on campus who's been writing for so long
Yeah.
and had like such a long-term experience with Oni. And like even though perhaps I've written more recently for Oni than she has, I often speak to her about her experience writing for Fit, for example, or for Spice, which is not something that I was able to do. So I think having someone on a ticket who has written long term is really beneficial, even if maybe like the output has petered off recently, because I think she's had a really like long-term experience and knows what the paper has been like in many iterations. And since like, you know, every ticket has had their own unique vision, she can like, you know, share some of those, what the paper was like in the past and in those pre-COVID days.
Yeah.
And I think that like her commitment has been shown by like in the ticket building process and in like the output that she will.
Yeah. And, you know, as with everyone on our ticket, we've written for a wealth of different student publications on campus. That's really important considering our policy is to increase outreach between publications and to find Oni's place alongside them.
Members of your ticket regularly submit articles late. Given this pattern of behavior, how will you manage the many hard deadlines that Oni has?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think.
I think communication is a huge thing within our ticket. Obviously, everyone has different capacities. That changes over the semester. I think an empathetic approach is perhaps the most productive, and I think that we can achieve that because we're all very good friends. Obviously, that then, you know, there's an opposite side to that where there might be leniencies or, you know, concessions made which might not be productive, but I think that as long as we're aware of them as a ticket and are committed to producing work on time of good quality.
It's all about setting boundaries
Yeah.
whilst also being empathetic. I also think as an editor you have a lot more ability to channel more of your efforts into the paper. Like, you know, being an Oni writer is an unpaid job, which I can understand why, but I think that as a result of that, students often like have to put their Oni articles on the back burner. I've often done this because your assignment's coming first, your job's coming first, and like unfortunately your Oni article, though important, like falls to the wayside because of the trials and tribulations of life. But I think as an Oni editor, it is a different role and a different position, and you step into it knowing the work that it takes and treating it like a job and like a higher priority in your life.
How will you manage these late submissions from reporters next year?
I think just anticipating them.
And making flexibility in our kind of schedule to allow for that. That's probably the main thing.
I know that this year's team has started requesting articles earlier than in years past, and you've got a bit of a longer time frame than years past, which I think is good for such contingencies. Obviously, you don't want that to be a pattern with writers, and I think obviously being empathetic, because we can be harder on each other because we're friends and we know what's going on, but you never know what's going on in a reporter's life, and you don't want writing for Oni to be we can't speak about outreach and say that we want to be welcoming, and then at the same time act like students have to drop everything and write. So I think being empathetic and understanding, always having contingency plans, worst case scenario, if you have to pull an article and put it in the next week, there's always something you can fill up there. There's always campus news. There's always campus news. But I think and also obviously keeping our Sundays free and being able to work through articles quickly.
So Aiden is the only person on your team this year who has submitted art for Oni. How will you manage the artistic aspects of the paper next year?
I think one thing that we've seen in recent years is a really great student engagement with art, and so obviously all of our ticket members are willing to learn, but I think so upskilling is one part of that, but also really encouraging students to pitch art, like the election edition of Oni that was just released. Great art from Evelyn Redford. I think that's kind of our main take.
Definitely, and I think we've had discussions already in the chat about people who have art experience and just potentially haven't pitched art for Oni because they weren't sure about the process in the same way. But I think obviously that's something that we'll have a discussion about, but something that can be handled.
Do you think this upskilling will be a significant barrier throughout the year? Is this something you would want to do throughout the year or before your term starts, that sort of thing?
Well, I think it's something that would be handled mostly before the term starts, and it's already being handled now by there's discussions of Procreation, different Adobe suites used to create art. So I think that will be handled early on, but everyone's willing to, dip their toes in and give it a try. But there are obviously stronger artistic. I have no strong artistic skills, but many on the ticket do who are willing.
I think the main issue we might face is everyone has very strong artistic visions for the paper, but articulating that visually is probably one of the main challenges. We have support from publication staff, past tickets. I think everyone is really committed to learning things.
And we have many months until our first edition in February.
So
speaking about kind of team dynamics and learning within the team, obviously a part of working in a team is that there are disagreements in that team, particularly when you have 10 people. How will you manage disagreements within Flirt? And I guess... Sorry, someone just moved something on the door. How will you manage disagreements within Flirt, and what's your approach to team dynamics?
Well, I think what we've seen so far is that open dialogue in the group is probably the most productive way of going about conflict. When we were kind of preparing to run a campaign seriously, there were things we disagreed on, whether that was in terms of graphics or kind of what our policy statement should look like. Bringing that to the group early and with an open mind was really the most productive way of going about it, and it meant that we didn't have to resolve issues straight away. There is time to mull over and to think and to reconsider your position, but I think as long as everyone already has shown that they're willing to engage with each other empathetically, that's
what about when there are hard deadlines, and I suppose when you're not editing you have a lot of time to kind of mull over those things? What about when it's a Sunday, it's 10 p.m, there's a disagreement then?
I would say a vote. A vote, and I mean, when there are 10 people, it would be 7 votes, like
Yeah.
needing 7 upvotes, or like this is something that we'd obviously decide
Yeah.
beforehand and consult everyone about. But I think eventually you need to have a hard vote. And I think that there are so many, like everyone needs to understand, and we do because we all care about Oni and we're passionate about the paper, and you know, walking away from this experience with friends with each other, friends with our reporters. I think that, you know, not everything's going to go your way.
Yeah.
It's an important lesson of life.
Yeah.
And there are so many, what I was trying to say is there are so many decisions that you have to make in Oni, so many decisions to make on a Sunday. So, you know, if you lose out on one decision, it's merely one of many. So I think just being willing to brook that, and, you know, having votes when needed, and someone being willing to call it and saying like, all right, this discussion is unproductive.
Yeah.
Let's vote on if this article goes in.
And I think realizing as well that we're working for a larger student body. Like it's not about us.
It's not about us.
This is not about us. Like this is about giving students, like writing for students, having students write for us.
I think keeping perspective in mind is really important.
Yeah.
Like there's no point wasting our time deciding on like, you know, the positioning of a certain design. Obviously it's like might mean the world to us on a Sunday, but I think that it's way more important about, you know, keeping like meeting deadlines and keeping the paper alive.
Yeah, I guess the position of a certain thing is one thing. What about like things like political disagreements within the team? How would that be managed, particularly when you look at kind of like long term what you want to achieve with the paper over that year? I know you've got some members of your team in different political factions. So what about like kind of harder issues?
Yeah, I suppose we've already started having those discussions now. We had one this morning actually, and so I guess sorting that kind of stuff in a broad sense out early before we start editing, when it comes to 10 p.m. deadlines on a Sunday night, making sure that any kind of like any political issue that someone might have on the ticket should not be aired at that time. Like we know about pitches a week in advance, we decide on pitches a week in advance. That should be aired when the pitch is given, when it's received, and kind of we talk about, you know, what that's going to look like in the article once we get the article. Kind of hashing that out early.
I can't see why it would come up last minute. I like obviously maybe as a worst case scenario, but I imagine that like a lot of we can anticipate a lot of sort of political disagreements that may happen. Like we all have our finger on the pulse on what's happening right now. So and we can anticipate that, you know, we obviously, I think it's not a huge issue because broadly we all agree on so many issues, being like strongly left wing. Then obviously it's important to have a plurality of and a diversity of opinions, you know, obviously within boundaries, and we have that. I think that's really beneficial because it means we have political disagreements so long as those disagreements are early. Like I don't actually see why disagreements are a bad thing early
disagreements
on.
Are very
so long
productive.
as we're not just like, you know, leaving them, like people are raising things too late or something, which I think is a expectation we'll set for all of us, that
and
we
we'll have
air things early.
Oni editors generally underload or defer during their term. How will the ticket manage their study commitments next year?
Great question. I think that it's sort of quite up to the individual person. I think everyone knows themselves and what they can handle. Everyone knows that Oni, if you're editing Oni, it should be one of your number one big priorities. Probably not, like, people treat Oni differently. Some people treat it as their number one first priority. Some people are able to juggle it with other things. I know that some people are thinking of deferring or doing part-time, and some people are good to continue with full-time study. And I think that if you look at tickets in the past, there's been a medley of all of that. So I think it's sometimes disappointing when people are really judgmental, I think, of people taking on certain loads, because I think so long as, you know, you're being held accountable by your team and you're not lagging behind, if you're able to maintain everything, I think it's all about trust and also maybe like calling people up on it politely or gently if something's clearly not working. Like, you know, if someone's clearly struggling and having too much on, you know, helping them for a bit and then maybe gently suggesting that something can be changed to make things easier. But I don't think there's any like hard and fast rules on
like
deferral.
we all need to underload.
We all need to underload. I also think there's no need to be doomsday about it.
I think balancing that with the mental health of our ticket is very important.
Editors also tend to leave their part-time jobs or reduce their hours. Is Oni congruous with the ticket's work commitments at this point?
I mean, like, again, that depends on the individual. I can't speak for everyone on the ticket. I know that, well, I mean, we haven't started editing yet, so there is room for change in the next kind of 6 months. People can work their work schedules around, I guess. But I know that mine isn't. Mine is congruent with editing Oni. I know that that's the case for a lot of people and that they are willing to make changes in their personal lives.
I think it would be pretty disappointing if everyone who had to edit Oni couldn't work at the
Yeah.
same time, because
Yeah, we
I
are
think
students.
that there are
you know.
there are so few people who are able to sacrifice work to do what is a really important thing for students, and it is paid, but it's not
We're
by
in a
any
cost of living
means
crisis.
it's not by any means a good sole income for many students, particularly those who are supporting themselves, and we have a range of people on our ticket, some who need to support themselves, some who are lucky enough not to. So I think that I wouldn't want to set the precedent for Oni in general, that Oni means you need to leave all your work commitments behind, because I think that's really disappointing in terms of how it restricts the editing team to only a certain subsect of society
And it's
who are
not
able to do that. It's not realistic.
It's not. Yeah, it doesn't enable. We want people from all backgrounds, everyone to be able to edit Oni and to not have to sacrifice their livelihoods, their way of earning money.
But again, it's up to the
It's up to the individual.
And
You guys have mentioned, like, in these answers have, like, what has come through is a lot of, like, kind of assumed flexibility in the next year among your ticket. Do you have examples that you'd like to share that have happened in this lead up where team members have actually been flexible and have actually shown, I guess, like, a commitment and putting the paper before other kind of arrangements?
Yeah. I think, again, not to harp on about the campaign trail thing that never happened, but yeah, I guess in the lead up to that, we were building very strongly, and so what that entailed in particular was writing up the policy statement and creating graphics. There were about 3 days that we had to write that policy statement. In those 3 days, like, the people who were delegated to do that job did that job, and we got it done on time. We got it done to a standard that the rest of the team was happy with, and we were able to submit our nomination early. So that was one thing. In terms of the graphics, I guess that's a good example of how people have already been upskilling and learning in their own time. Before that, I didn't know how to make, a DP filter, and I didn't know how to, like, format a policy tile. But that stuff will be coming out very soon on our social media. And so I guess, like, that was an example of people kind of teaming up together to do it, and realizing this is an interest that I have, this is something that I think should come before my other work commitments at the moment, and something that I think we need to do.
And because we haven't because we haven't committed to Oni yet, we were all juggling it with many of us, like, full-time uni and, like, pretty stringent, like, part-time jobs. But I think largely it is hard. Like, Simone's come up with some great examples, but I also think those examples won't be demonstrative because we aren't paid Oni editors yet. And I think that sort of when we step into that role, obviously we've, like, shown inklings of how we will act now, but I think things are very different once you step into that role and you accept that mandate from students.
Yeah, 100%.
It's my turn. What do you see as the biggest or most important events for Oni to cover in your term?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we won't know until they happen.
Of course. There are some things we can anticipate. Obviously, there's the usual student politics events. We'll send 2 people to the national conference for the National Union of Students. We'll have to cover Rep Select, which is, the usual. So obviously those standard annual things, we think that we'll be dealing with
Council every month,
but then also, like, a lot of, sorry, that's my father, some annual, like, some events that we can anticipate, for example, the consequences of the referendum, whatever that may be. I think it's really important that we will report on that and interrogate them. Then also just, like, continuing, like, looking at the reports that Oni will receive or Oni will have to report on, such as, like, reports into sexual violence and student safety, like university accord reports that will be received and, like, that we can look into.
Changes to degree structures. We can anticipate as well across a variety of faculties.
So I think that's what we would be anticipating
to come
up, and then obviously anything that may arise.
Okay. What does Pulp's role as a culture magazine mean for what Oni should be publishing?
Yeah, I mean,
that's a really good question. I fortunately edited Pulp last year. I think that I'm really glad that Pulp and Oni exist at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that like some people think they step on each other's toes, but I don't think that they do at all. I think it's firstly great because it just allows more students to write in general, which is exactly what everyone wants to do. But I think that obviously they are very differently placed publications and what they can do, and that is like intrinsic to a lot of their features. For example, for Pulp, you have 3 or 4 weeks to write your article, whereas for Oni you have sort of like 4 or 5 days. So I think already your articles are going to be very different in content, in length. Pulp likes a lot more long features, and I think the type of culture that Pulp publishes is always a little bit different to Oni. Oni takes a little bit more like of a political stance on culture often, and Pulp looks into more, I think, things which are truly like forward ideas, but also very niche ideas. It's designed forward. Aesthetics focused.
I think your team's article about the Maryvale last year was perhaps a bit of an exception.
Yeah.
Would you say to what Pulp usually publishes and what Oni kind of is more geared towards in terms of holding corporations and management to account? But yeah, great article. But yeah, no, I think that there are definitely differences between the two. And there is a place for both of them on campus.
And I think
goes
that
without saying.
because Pulp is particularly embryonic, I think we'll see in the next couple of years how they sort of carve out their own niches and function with each other. Like obviously there are overlaps, like there will be an article that can go to either publication.
Yeah.
Like let's say the analysing a certain like cultural institution could go either way. But I think that like communication between the two papers is really important as the two, the paper and the magazine understand sort of its niche and what would be best in a certain paper.
Just to add to that very quickly, I guess it's important to remember that Oni is an SRC publication. It will publish things related to the Student Representative Council, student politics, which is not necessarily in Pulp's remit.
Yeah.
Okay. What sort of news should Oni cover outside of USyd?
So true. I guess any news that affects students. So that could be in terms of state or federal education reforms. I guess that goes for kind of secondary and tertiary, when we're looking at targeting first year readers and writers. But I suppose also issues that we kind of highlighted in our platform about climate justice, about First Nations justice, about kind of sexual assault for young people, the issues that are affecting young people.
And I think applying a student lens to what, particularly what might be mainstream news, but looking at it from a new, fresh angle, from a student angle. I think, students are not only students. They come from, many walks of life.
They're
and
also
I think
workers.
They're workers, And they want to see that reflection in the paper.
Yeah,
they don't want to just see that they attend uni, and because most students do so much more than that.
Yeah, I guess in that answer you kind of focused a lot on students, and I guess what I would kind of consider one particular type of student experience in which university cuts might be, or not university cuts, but rather, degree restructuring might be the biggest thing in some people's lives. How will you broaden that out, I guess, to other social issues? And are you sure that everyone on your ticket is kind of picking up on different avenues of news, and how are you going to, if not, ensure that?
Okay, that's sort of like a two-part question.
Yeah. We'll divide it.
So we'll start with, sorry, what was the first part?
The first part was, I guess, I can't even remember. I guess, how will you ensure that I think a lot of news, obviously 10 people, might come from a similar walk of life. How will you ensure that you're covering news that doesn't just apply to your 10 walks of life? That's
a really important question.
So I guess one of the main parts of our policy is that we don't want just editors to be writing news. And so that kind of gets at the core of having students write about what is affecting them in their lives, not imposing our experiences onto the paper. We're just here to facilitate. And so I guess, really getting students to write about what they feel is important on and off campus is kind of our main focus.
Definitely, and I think obviously knowing as Oni editors that it is our responsibility to look into all aspects of the university, even if that's not ones that we're intimately connected with. For example, I may not do a science degree, but I know that it's very important to stay tapped into any news that's occurring there. I have friends who study that degree, and just making sure that we have close connections with like with faculties, with societies,
With societies
in
is a big
all,
one.
mainly
Yeah.
societies,
Yeah.
in all of like these range of areas.
Yeah.
And I think that makes sure that news gets covered. I think also like Oni gets so many, like Oni has a tip form where we
Yeah.
can get anonymous tips. It also has an email, like Oni is renowned on and off campus, I think, as a really important student publication. So I think just responding to like emails we receive or any sort of prompts we may get for news and making sure that it all gets covered both by editors and by students.
Yeah.
You have mentioned this a few times, but you keep mentioning like students bringing news to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously that's like kind of a lot has to happen in order for students to do that. What would the practical steps look like in ensuring that students are bringing news to you, number one, and that they feel comfortable in bringing news to you?
I have some thoughts,
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think that that's something that happens to students, like student reporters, over time. And I think that's something that it's our job as editors to help sort of facilitate that over time. Because I know, like, you know, when I first started writing for Oni, when I first started writing news, the only news I wrote was the news that they would post on
Yeah.
the Facebook page. And
Which
they'd be
is a
like,
great way to
Which is a
start.
great way to
Yeah,
start. And I think
yeah.
that's how everyone starts. So I think, obviously, we have a lot of students start with protest coverage
Yeah.
or with very simple news. And I think as editors, we can also explain, like, different levels of news coverage for a new reporter, or like this is for a more experienced reporter.
Yep.
We can engage in co-writing where someone who's more experienced or an editor can write with a new reporter. And so I think once a new reporter has written news, like news that we have given them or news that they have heard, like in the mainstream, it's then up to us to sort of teach them the processes through which we find news to them. And I think that that's a process, like there are many different ways of doing that. I think like so many things are newsworthy and students just don't know it, like what might be occurring in their classes day to day, like what one of their assignments involves. Like, for example, my assignment in my OLE at the moment genuinely like advocates for us to use generative AI, and it's like, please use generative AI and then cite it. And this is in my cognitive psychology OLE.
Yeah.
So I think that that's something that I would say is like newsworthy for Ani, like that's something that we should be reporting on.
Yeah.
And that's something that any student could see in the course of, like, there are many other students in my class, and they might not know it's
It would
like
fit under
that
the
it would
remit
fit under
of,
the remit of news unless we sort of welcomed them and allowed them to come with any sort of thoughts.
Yeah.
I remember in first year I was able to tell my editor anything, and she was very kind and lovely, Shania, about how she felt about different news that I brought.
Yeah.
And then I think there are just some processes. Sorry, I spoke to them earlier, but like very abstractly. Keeping in touch with the NTU and what they're doing, like, we have a plethora of social media websites at our fingertips, and we can sort of share those links that, like, the way I find news, I can just share that with my reporters, and making sure my reporters feel as comfortable as possible to come to us. Yeah. Sorry, that was really cool.
Would you publish a video of police violence at a protest, even if the victim of that violence has asked you not to?
That's
a great question. I think to protect the individual, no, we wouldn't publish it. If it was their explicit wish not to be published, we would have to respect that.
Yeah.
Also, there are defamation
Yeah.
legality clauses that are constraining that.
But I think that there are ways, because I think if we get to the crux of that question, the basic importance is like, social justice, and are we exposing police violence? Which I think is something that you can still do even if you're not publishing a particular video. Chances are, like, there would be like other videos potentially of police violence or other examples of police violence. They can be written about. There might be recordings that could be published, like if it's at a protest, like recordings, like audio recordings instead of video recordings.
Instead of that, we could blur the faces.
Yeah,
so
we could blur the faces. So I think there are so many ways around. That doesn't mean that we're, entirely dropping
exposing
off.
this person to potentially, especially if they're from a marginalised background or something, exposing this person to more violence or more abuse.
Like, we have a duty both to expose
care
police and violence, but also a duty
Yeah.
of care to students
To our
and
writers.
as journalists.
Yeah.
So I guess as a follow-on to that, would you publish an article or any content that you think is in the public interest, even if there's a risk that it's defamatory?
I know my answer.
Here you go.
Yeah. I would never put our team or the SRC in any kind of, if it was a really pressing danger of defamation, then that would become more difficult. But if I would still push ahead. wanting to
so.
publish something
I think
like
I would
that.
err on this, depending on whether, like, if it's in the student interest. I think if it's in
Yeah.
the student interest, that like sort of tilts the calculus in the sense that it should be published.
Yeah.
Because I think particularly some things that and also like who is the defamation affecting.
Yeah.
So I just think like balancing like who are we potentially defaming, and are we reaping a great student benefit, or are we like are we punching down a student politician, or are we punching
this is
up
true too.
to like management who are having huge impacts on students.
Yeah, it would depend on who we're affecting.
Yeah.
But I would err on the side of yes.
Yeah.
How will you run Oni's social media? Do you have any strategies for expanding Oni's presence on Instagram or TikTok, and how will you achieve that alongside the high demands of publishing a weekly paper?
We can talk about, so we have a big part in our policy about multimedia. Obviously, again, differentiating that from other student publications on campus. But I think, we saw, I'll bring this up as an example because it's my favourite example. Patrick McKenzie, his 370 podcast, absolute banger of a podcast, and also the last podcast that Oni has published, like the most recent one. So I think bringing stuff like that back, and not necessarily as a regular addition to the paper or the publication, but as something that students can engage with, as something that kind of builds interest, builds momentum, as a novelty, would be really productive.
I think also then on the news side of things, drawing some experiences we've had from social media for societies, or like experience I've had for social media for pulp, or drawing from people in pulp who did that very well. I think it is really important to translate big news, like breaking coverage, into social media form. I think it's actually almost like remiss not to, because I think that just so many more students are able to engage with it in that way. And if we all agree as editors that a piece of Oni is breaking news, like for example something really important on strikes or about climate justice, I think if we agree with that, it is worth putting the time in to making that on multimedia. That makes it so much more accessible to more students. Like the way that social media algorithms work is the outreach that would get is like multiplies. So I think that it's not something that we would sacrifice our time editing to do for every single little event. But I think for news where we think students ought know, things about, perhaps things we've revealed on campus or done by management, I think that is really important, that we would put that time in on a Sunday or throughout the week to turn that into something multimedia. I also think that, we all use social media all the time, so we're all pretty adept at it.
Yeah, exactly. Especially Instagram, which probably has the most outreach and the most interaction, potentially more than Facebook at the moment, particularly on this campus. So I think that's.
You're running with 9 members. Why?
Do you want to do this option?
Yeah. I mean, so we were really committed to kind of building the ticket with a strong focus on interpersonal connection, on a strong commitment to different talents and bringing in different experiences onto the ticket. 9 members was kind of what we, I don't know, it felt right. I don't know.
I think in the building process, that was who we found, but I think we're erring on the side of having a 10th member, and that would just involve the typical process of an interview and a discussion. I think we just didn't want to rush adding any members.
That was the big.
And then we were balancing that with obviously our study commitments at the time, and so we didn't. We were avoiding rushing, adding new members, making sure everyone. And an interview process is great because it makes sure that as long as that interview, EOI has big outreach, then we can perhaps reach people that we may not have thought to
exactly. We really didn't want to rush and choose someone just from a small pool just to have a 10th member. We wanted to make sure they fit within the team, fit within our dynamics.
Give everyone a fair shot.
So you definitely plan on adding a 10th member?
Yes.
Many people asked to join your ticket earlier on, and you still have 9 members. Was this kind of what is the process of ensuring that they fit within your team, and why have
that's
not been the
question? I might unfortunately dispute. I don't think people asked very early on. I think that we received sort of when the gossip column was finally published and our names were out. That was pretty recently. That's when we received sort of a couple of people who expressed interest in being added on. and they were like, do you have another spot? At that time, to be clear, we were actually considering running with 9.
We were pretty set on.
We were pretty set on that.
Running with 9.
Before we started, we were happy to be a full ticket at the time because we thought that we all worked well together, which that hasn't changed. I think we were just having discussions recently about study load, workload, and realised that having a 10th member might be all the more beneficial.
Yeah.
So I think at that point it was like not very much time to quickly add someone on and reject others.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we chose to put a pause on at that time and come back to it when we have more time to review it.
Yeah.
Review that. But yeah, I wouldn't say we got lots of people early on.
No.
What do you think makes a good Oni editor?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think that I think so many students on campus would make a good Oni editor. Obviously, like, I say we, like, there's nothing that makes Simone and I special. We're speaking on behalf of the ticket.
Speaking on behalf of the ticket.
But I think obviously you need to have written for Oni, ideally.
Yeah.
Having, like, outside publication experience is just, like, helpful, but it's not, like, needed. I think what's really important is just a commitment to the paper, an ability to give up your time or some of your time next year to learn, and like obviously political compatibility, a bit of like political flexibility because, and just flexibility in general, that you know that your idea isn't going to come through every single time, but creativity and innovation in your politics and also in what you can bring to the paper, what you think is important about the paper. So yeah, writing experience, editing experience is obviously a bit of a standard, but then I think just what we found, like, every member of our ticket really brings something different to the table, and that's really helpful from a diversity perspective.
Yeah.
In all senses of the word.
Yeah, I suppose just a love for the paper.
I think like passion and love is number one. Like the best writer in the world might not bring the sort of the team player skills and the love for Oni and the willingness to dream up big things and make them work that we think we're going to do this year.
Yeah.
Next year.
So true.
You kind of briefly mentioned politics in that answer.
Yep.
Oni is, like, proudly a left-wing paper. How much, I guess, does that kind of play into it, particularly?
I think a lot.
Oh, a lot.
Sorry, I know it was briefly mentioned because
Yeah.
it's a bit of a laundry list of thoughts.
Yeah.
But I think, I almost briefed over it because it is, I think, so accepted in the Oni community that Oni is a left-wing paper. And although we accept a plurality of left-wing views, by left-wing it means like there is no view that is bigoted, there is no view that is hurtful to like students on campus, or like marginalized groups of society. So I think that politics are really important. That just like helps with how the ticket functions. I remember at the 2021 induction day, Dominic Knight was there and he was talking about how his ticket, they had one member of every political faction at Oni because they thought that would be funny. They said it was a disaster, and obviously we wouldn't do that for political moral reasons. But I also think that it just speaks to how like you have to strike a balance. You don't want everyone to believe the exact same thing all the time.
It's not productive.
Because you need political disagreements, but you can't have big political agreements of like, does said person deserve rights?
Yeah,
Or
do we support the strikes? Like
yeah,
that's
exactly.
not
That's not productive for anyone.
Yeah, and it's offensive and hurtful for a lot of people. Yeah.
Much of your policies are repeats of previous years. Would you describe yourselves as an establishment ticket? And what are the biggest things you are seeking to change about Oni?
I wouldn't consider ourselves an establishment ticket. I think that what is coming through in our policy is that we have a really good understanding of Oni as a paper, the culture that surrounds Oni on campus. I am the only member of student politics on the ticket currently. We just all have a love for writing and a love for this paper. I wouldn't say we're an establishment. What was the second part of the question, sorry?
What's the biggest thing you're seeking to change if you're not?
So I think that obviously to some extent all policies are going to be like recall each other because so many tickets who have edited Oni, we draw from them because we love what they did with the paper. We love what you guys are doing with the paper and many years before. We all are like left-wing tickets who think it's important to platform student voices. I think that it is, like we wouldn't want to come as a new ticket and insist on breaking the mold because I think so much of what Oni does works. But I do think that we have some ideas to shake things up not to use your phrase, I don't know why I said that.
To flirt.
So, to flirt.
To flirt things up.
I think one of those big things is sort of the practical ideas that we have, or like big dreams we have about outreach with different universities and different student media, and in creating a stronger student media community, perhaps having a student media conference.
Yes.
So ideas like that, and I think all of these ideas would incorporate all students, not just student journalists in the establishment per se. And I think that that's something
Every
we're really
student
strong.
is a student
Every
journalist.
student is a student journalist.
Every student's a reporter.
Everyone is a writer.
Everyone's a writer.
Everyone's a writer.
Building on the studio conference, what are your policy points? How would you get this running, especially given like it's a lot of effort in organizing one and there's already massive demands for Ani as an editor?
That's a really good question. And look, I don't want it to seem like we're going to construct this utopia.
No.
Because I think what's really important is so many student journalists on campus for so many years have had dreams of like a student journalism conference or like student journalism groups, student media groups. And I think that it's all about every ticket taking a little stride forward and a little step forward for that happening. And the size of our step obviously will be governed by the demands of the paper, but I think that in times of space, such as like the July holidays, mid-semester breaks, also during autonomous edition weeks, we're more able to dedicate some time into thinking about how we could like feasibly have sort of a student journalism conference, which is like, I mean, Ani runs lots of student journalism events for UCID students, so just seeing if we could involve other universities, starting in New South Wales, but even extending beyond that if possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, UTS is just up the road.
Yeah.
Like, so, that would be a small step forward that we could take.
And already we're in contact with a lot of these
Yes.
editors. And so I think it's just utilising those contacts
Yeah.
and also pooling resources and sharing resources between student media
Definitely.
organisations.
There's currently a Facebook group for studio people across Australia, which is very much dead. How would you bring this conference alive when the current system is not working?
Ariana's been thinking a lot about this.
No, it has been something I've been thinking about. I wouldn't say it's too dead because I would say it's new. So I would say, again, I think it was a stride forward of teams in the past who were sort of the first to step forward with an idea, and obviously no one team can bring it to total fruition. And so I think already just the fact that we have a group where people are knowing each other's names, knowing the names of other publications in other universities. I think there have been some weekly Zoom meetings or some Zoom meetings that people have been a part of. Like, I think already that's a step forward, and it is a way to communicate and contact with them. So I wouldn't say it's like dead per se, but it's not sort of the alive culture we would want. So I think it's just building off of that, utilising our contacts at other newspapers, reaching out to people, being open. You'll like whoever travels to the national conference will meet people there. I think obviously we would like delay anything we would to do to be like a bit later on in the year when we have more time and more planning to think about it. But I think as long as we have those contacts and are able to use them, I think that it is a possibility. I wouldn't want to shut it down lest we think of logistical implications.
Even if the conference isn't to happen, would you say your team would be able to build on the connections that there are already between these groups?
Yes,
Definitely. I think that we've started that already, just with our personal contacts, and then we would try and do outreach as much as possible. We were even like thinking of like collaborations in the paper between different student media organisations. It's all about open communication as early as possible. We have a year which is so short and also so long. So I think any stride forward would be really important to us, and then that could hopefully pave the way
for the next team.
Yep.
Oh my god, talking about the next team already.
As well as in your policies, you mentioned renewing mediums such as creative and investigations. What does renewing investigations look like? How would you accomplish this?
I think like renewing investigations just as in opening the doors for more students to write them and to work with them, and making like formatting investigations differently, so in multimedia formats and in like short form, long form, breaking news form. So I think renewing them in that sense, making them a big priority. I think when we say renew, that doesn't mean that like we think this team has done a really
amazing.
incredible job.
Yeah.
So I think just building off of that renewal, since COVID, where perhaps they were a bit more difficult to acquire, particularly like in-person sort of interrogations and in-person interviews. So I think, just trying to make things as accessible through multimedia and accessible through like new students writing with students, that sort of thing.
And in terms of renewing creative works, what places creative works have in Oni? Do you think there's sufficient creative stuff in Oni right now?
Yeah, I think creative work has a huge place in Oni. I am personally a bit of I love creative writing. I think that there is room to maybe potentially have a bit more of it in Oni, because it's not necessarily something that we see in other publications. I know that Avenue does have a fiction, has quite a strong fiction stronghold, but that is an annual publication. So, I think it does have a place, and I think that it can be about stuff that happens on campus. I've written creative pieces about that to make sure that they're still relevant to students. But yeah, I think we could kind of expand that. Not to say that we should then sacrifice other things in the paper. That wouldn't necessarily what would be happening. Like, creative writing would be an addition. It wouldn't be to sacrifice anything else.
I think there is almost, as you say, no sense of sacrifice, because I think that, if you get boiled down to the crux of it, if you have someone who wants to write about an experience they've had at uni, they might feel better putting it in fictional form, putting it in poetic form, putting it in photographic form, and it's still the same narrative being sent across that you would in a perspective piece.
Yeah, exactly. Part of writing is telling stories, whether that be through a news writing style. Obviously, we wouldn't want to put creative writing with narrative and storytelling is a huge part of writing. I think it definitely has a place.
No lies.
I think it definitely has a place in this paper.
Cool.
Yeah.
You also mentioned publishing balanced and accurate accounts of SRC Council and SRC Council and SRC and USU elections. Do you think this already takes place? And as well as that, how would you get the broader student body to engage with these accounts? Because currently it's very much those in those circles are the ones that engage with these reports and stuff.
Yeah. I think it is already being done. I think you guys have done a great job with kind of providing that coverage. But I want to make it clear as well that when we talk about including balanced and accurate coverage, we do not mean including right-wing rhetoric in our writing. That is we would never publish anything like that. But I think in terms of getting a greater outreach to students who maybe aren't engaged in student politics, I think a great way of doing that is to cover protests that are happening on campus, to cover just to cover SRC. If you get people reading about it, if you get people understanding what's happening, and if they can see that their interests are being reflected, whether it be in other stuff that Oni publishes or things that are happening in council, that is the best way to get people engaged.
I think that this team has done a really good job already by using social media and multimedia, because I think that someone might not want to sit down and read an SRC report, but they are curious as to what their reps are saying about them.
The Twitter feeds are great.
The Twitter feeds, the Instagrams, those authorial incursions.
Yeah,
they're funny.
Incursions.
They're useful.
Yeah.
And I think just making sure that SRC coverage speaks at a level that all students can understand, that they're never arcane or only
or bureaucratic.
And so I think that's also where multimedia and social media are really important.
Another interesting policy point was weekly photojournalism. What would this look like? What would it be of? Do you think photography looks good in newspaper print, given that often it doesn't print as well as artworks and such?
So I think this was a thought that we had because we think that every time you welcome new mediums into the paper, you welcome new students. That's a form of outreach, and you welcome, a new way to connect with society and to connect with students and their stories. Perhaps those photos might not look the nicest in print, but I think that it is important to have a balance of photography and of art. And I think that photography can tell a story that's really important, often about news or often just about people's day-to-day lives. So I think that's something we would be willing to do, and those photographs would also be online. But I think obviously we would be at the whim of the students who are publishing. We wouldn't put in photos for the sake of it. But I think it's just another way to encourage students when you're providing them with prompts of ways they can get involved with the paper, and it will be getting often new students involved to tell stories.
Yeah, and I think it would fit really nicely within kind of the work that is already being done in Honi. Like, it would work really well alongside creative writing, or it could be a great way of like telling a story about a protest, or something like that in news coverage. So I think that it definitely would fit in with what is already being done in the paper, as well as being a new edition.
Does anyone on the ticket currently have photojournalism experience? And as well as that, like, how would you encourage reporters to sort of like develop the skill, to build on the skill?
Yeah, I think we definitely have experience. I mean, yeah, I don't want to speak on behalf of other people, but I know that like Aiden and Zena are particularly interested in this. I also have a background in like photography a little bit. So yeah, I think in terms of us having the experience to pull this kind of thing off, I think we could definitely do it. In terms of how we want to go about encouraging other students to do it, I think kind of how your team has been facilitating mentoring, like seminar sessions as well as Honi Hangouts. I think that kind of sets a precedent for macro level engagement, where you kind of sit down, talk about what photojournalism is, what it looks like, how it would kind of be implemented into the paper, but also on a more interpersonal micro level, kind of talking about personal ideas and like personal style, and how the individual wants to go about telling those stories through photos.
Yeah, definitely.
As well in your policy, what does a facility for journalist identity and career development, as described in your policy document, mean?
Yeah. Well, I think at its most basic, that just means people writing as much as they can. So you get that wealth of experience across a range of different like writing styles, including art and photojournalism. Yeah.
You mentioned as well increasing diversity in Honi. How exactly would you go about doing this?
I think again that like speaks to outreach and inclusivity. Our outreach has to be wide ranging in terms of the students we engage with on campus, and like where they're from, what year they're in, and then I also think that how we empower them to feel like their words and their stories matter. Because like it's all well and good for students, first year students or like international students to know about Honi, but unless you make it particularly clear that their stories are welcome and needed, then that like is futile unless you do that.
Yeah. So
I think that is really done by like trusting, friendly, interpersonal relationships. Particularly like reporter, like it's important to have reporter hangouts at a macro level, but also at a micro level. I don't think I would have written for Honi as much as I have had it not been for my really close relationships with my editors, but particularly my first relationship when I was so vulnerable and thought nothing I had to say was worthwhile. Like I think that's particularly when it comes in. So I think using that knowledge and sort of making sure that we spend time fostering those relationships is really a good way to make sure that there's increased diversity in the paper and what people are writing about and what they feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, I guess one of our tangible policy points as well is creating more opportunities for multilingual pieces in the paper, a multilingual edition perhaps. So yeah, really facilitating concrete spaces where we are welcoming that kind of content that we don't see in mainstream media. And we have expertise on the ticket that would allow for that, to facilitate that.
How would you go ahead in facilitating multilingual content in the sense where someone on your ticket, say, let me phrase this better. So someone is wanting to provide multilingual content, however, no one on your team is able to have that expertise in that language sort of thing. How would you go ahead in editing that, especially bringing in someone to say edit it, having the burden of them doing it, who's not getting paid to do that sort of thing?
That's a great question. We sort of navigated that in Pulp this and last year, and I know that the Honi editors have navigated it in the past. So I think first and foremost we would sort of chat to them, draw from them what they did, and I think what worked well with Pulp is actually just speaking to the writer, what they think might work, having an open discussion from the beginning and saying like, we want this to be possible, we want you to be able to publish your work in both English and this language. So I think having that open discussion, because the writer may have better ideas than you do, like particularly if we don't speak that language or aren't able to edit in that language, and they might have ideas of people who are willing to edit. I think that editing one piece, we would make sure that it's not a really onerous responsibility on them, and more just like a quick check over that
Yeah.
like there is match up between
Yeah.
the two languages if possible. But I think that people can often will enjoy or want to draw from their families or from societies on campus,
Yeah.
and we would be willing to sort of function with societies and work with them in tandem and make sure that they don't feel exploited in a sense that sort of will like have a working relationship with them over the year.
Yeah.
And sort of provide things for each other.
Yeah.
And that's sort of one of the great services that we can be helped out with.
Yeah.
But I think, it would be a case-by-case basis.
Do you have any ideas of systems in place that you would have in checking these pieces? Because there's been history of pieces being done through Google Translate, and readers are bringing this up. So is there any systems in place that you would put in making sure that these multilingual content isn't just like a Google Translate copy of like an English version?
I think one kind of not caveat, but something I want to raise with that is that we would never want to put a student in a position where they're having to justify their cultural background or their language experience. Like, obviously part of making a culturally safe environment is that we would never question that part of their identity. But of course that is a practical concern. Did you want to?
I think that just having it read over by like potentially someone from a society, someone in their family, someone who they know is able to read through. But I think, as Simone said, like obviously we'd have a commitment to accuracy and making sure that we can sort of check, like find ways to check it, find someone who speaks the language. But like as Simone said, like minor issues in that language, I think does not detract from how important it is for that piece to be published in the first place. And I think obviously Honi has really high reporting standards in English, and it should have high reporting standards in other languages, but I think that cultural connection and story that a student can tell is much more important than their article being, flawless in such language. I think in a sense,
something.
like perhaps incorrect syntax tells its own story in the student's relationship with the language, and that's really important.
Briefly describe your ticket's politics.
So true. So obviously very left-wing politics. In our policy, we highlighted that we have a strongly anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist stance. So what that looks like is, I guess we've kind of already been over it, but it focuses on, an anti-collegeist stance, a pro-strike stance, solidarity with international students, sexual assault survivors on campus, looking at kind of radical climate justice, and platforming First Nations justice.
I guess what's notably missing in that answer, is kind of like a class approach. How do you plan on kind of like engaging with issues related to class and related to, wealth, particularly in the current cost of living crisis?
Yeah, well, I think class intersects with a lot of the issues that I've raised. Like, class is an intersectional issue. So I think that it is an integral part of our discussions on, the issues facing international students in this cost of living crisis, the issues that we see affecting sexual assault survivors. Like, I don't think we could have discussions about these issues without also highlighting class and people's diverse experiences of class. And I guess part of really engaging with students and having student-led journalism is that they are able to talk about that themselves.
Yeah, I think largely it's something that's impossible to miss if we're reporting on big news pieces that affect students in the cost of living crisis and reporting on the budget, things like that. So I think that it would be really important to spotlight students of different classes, and I think that is sort of best done in outreach and also empathetic outreach, and that's sort of harks back to what we were speaking before about why we think that all students should be able to edit Honi regardless of perhaps commitments to work, and students should be able to, we have to take an empathetic approach to students maybe pitching an article and no longer being able to write it based on things going on in their lives.
Can you both mention one time where you've demonstrated these kind of political beliefs or your ticket's politics in
each of us?
Memory? Yeah, just each.
Just any part of the politics?
Yeah, a hard example of these politics and this theory being put into practice.
Yeah. So as a grassroots member. I'm involved in quite a lot of activism, organising and building on campus. I guess one example that sticks out to me was when I've spoken at rallies before. One was on campus when the Education Action Group and the Enviro Collective collaborated to do an anti-Thales and anti-Santos rally in the quad. So I spoke about the university's investments, ongoing investments and kind of collaboration with Santos. I also spoke at the anti-George Pell rally earlier in the year with a focus on justice for sexual assault survivors and particularly like the treatment of women in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and that's really important. I've attended rallies and both on and off campus, and I also think that just for example, in my personal life, I volunteer at the Welfare Rights Centre, and that's something I wrote about for Honi as well because I thought it was very important. I think that sort of engagement with community legal centres or mutual aid organisations, I've often written about mutual aid and community legal centres both for Honi and out of Honi. I think that for me has been a good way of putting politics into practice, particularly the Welfare Rights Centre. What they do is they provide support to people who have, when Centrelink has raised a debt against them or when Centrelink has made an unfair decision. I think that for me has opened my eyes to a lot of the issues plaguing Centrelink, and that's very relevant for many students on campus who are on youth allowance payments and benefits. So I think that's a way that my politics have been put into practice, and also I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Part of Honi's efficacy in being a critical left-wing platform is its independence from factions. So I guess this is a pretty timely question: is will you stay an active member of Grassroots next year?
My plan is to stay as an active member of Grassroots, provided that there is not a serious conflict that I come up against. If there is an issue where I can't report on NatCon, for example, or there is a serious issue potentially with the outcome of the presidential election, which we'll find out soon, where it will restrict me from reporting on certain things and from providing a critical stance, then obviously I'll reconsider that position. But for the moment, I'm committed to staying.
And I think that's a very beneficial thing.
Yeah.
I think having students who are both members of factions and not members of factions are both really helpful for Honi.
Yep.
I was a member of Switch for a bit of time, and even in that short time I learned so much more about the university and so much more about student politics that I think I would bring to Honi, and I imagine Simone has triple that. Yeah, so I think that's a really important asset.
I think it is important for Honi editors to maintain kind of an activist stance. Your speech at the rally yesterday, amazing. So would love to see more of that in the future.
Sure. Okay, so let's look more broadly than factional politics. Amani Tanganoa on your ticket is the president of the MacArthur branch of Young Labour. Do you think that being a prominent member of the Labour Party is politically compatible with the vision of a radical Honi?
That's a really good question. I think that, importantly, membership in Young Labour and Labour are different. But I also think that it's not incompatible to be a member within an organisation and to criticise that organisation.
Yeah.
Particularly when I don't see Young Labour as the sort of organisation to kick people out based on what they've written for Honi. And I also think every person on our ticket puts Honi first, and then any experience they get from activism and from members of being factionally aligned second.
Yeah.
I think we've seen Honi editors in the past with Labour and with other factions do it really well in a way that it colours their opinions and brings carries knowledge, but Honi is still their first priority in breaking stories. I actually think it's actually a good way of finding out stories is sort of through involvement in those means. We don't shut ourselves off from other areas of campus. Because that's actually what brings the knowledge, us knowledge.
Yeah.
But so I think it's just about having a commitment to Honi first and foremost, and also an open dialogue. But I think largely Honi is a very respected paper in left-wing circles, including circles of Young Labour, and so I think that's something that we can make sure continues. But I think that largely also it's good to remember that our broad ticket, Hamani is one person in our ticket, and he's very valued. But I also think that it means that when it comes to majoritarian approaches, we won't necessarily be beholden to a faction, or we definitely won't be beholden to any certain faction.
Yeah. Sure, okay. So I think there might be a little bit of a difference here between being a member of the Labor Party and then being president of the Young Labor branch. How, I guess, do you think you'll manage conflicts in that sense? Because obviously the Labor Party are currently in power in every state on the mainland and federally. Obviously McCarthy Young Labor is a huge branch locally, just southwest of here. So I guess my question is, how do we manage, or not we, but how do you manage conflicts within your team? Particularly when I can imagine a lot of your reportage will surround things like university accords and other sort of Labor Party involvement in higher ed.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we've been thinking a lot about. I think that one thing that we've already established in our ticket is that we, very fundamentally, will take a critical view of the Labor Party. And so I think, for me, that's really important, and I know that it is for a lot of other people as well. And so I think that having those discussions that we've already had early on and establishing, and I know that it might be different when push comes to shove, and we have a particular issue that there might be a conflict of interest with various members of the ticket publishing, but I think that as long as we have that boundary already set, that this is something we're committed to doing, and that we will not compromise on.
Mm-hmm. And I think conflicts of interest with when it comes to one or two members of a ticket can be very easily resolved, in terms of there's lots that Honi has to report on that isn't Labor governed, and just sort of delegating the responsibilities in that sense.
Yeah, and it's important to remember as well that the SRC is a pluralist left-wing space. There are members of the executive that are quite high up in, on the SRC exec, that are quite high up in the Labor Party as well. But that's part of political discourse, political debate.
And I think it actually helps to hold Labor and our
Accountable.
view of Labor accountable more, in that we have this pluralist space within the bounds of left-wing.
Okay, sort of tangentially, Honi's relationship with campus activists in the SRC is sometimes tense, often complicated. How do you plan to engage with activists in your coverage?
Yeah, well, I know quite a lot of the activists on campus, I think, and a lot of our members do as well. I think that those personal connections are going to be really important to having kind of productive dialogue. I think avoiding crisis situations where they're obviously it's important to publish things that are going to hold student politicians to account, but avoiding that happen, a crisis happening the morning of publication or something. And I think that we can do that through the knowledge and the connections that we have.
I also think most student politicians, although no one wants their innermost secret to be revealed, so many student politicians on campus respect what Honi has done,
100%,
and they are for it, and so they believe that students deserve that information, and that's part of the reason why they're members of the SRC and working in the SRC and beyond. So I think that actually having discussions with them about what should and shouldn't be published can be really productive. The example you provided before, perhaps, of publishing something with police violence and whether or not you should do that. I think that those can be really productive discussions, because oftentimes we will align with them in what we think Honi's role is at uni. They're activists for a reason and believe Honi is a really important part of that.
I guess, how do you manage personal relationships with activists and Honi's role in holding them to account? So, obviously knowing activists is a very positive thing for Honi. It means that you have, an up-close look at the way that factions are they're getting involved in larger campaigns. Let's take gossip for an example, or a news story, we've been reporting on with the SRC elections. God forbid any member of our ticket was a Liberal, there would clearly be a conflict with something we published about Flirt for SRC. How would you manage personal relationships and Honi's role in holding activists to account?
Yeah, I suppose that comes down to sharing coverage like that. So if, for example, I don't know, in a hypothetical, we're publishing something about a specific individual or a specific group of people that one member in particular is very close to, obviously they won't be the member to publish that story or to write that story. That'll be someone else's job. They might provide insights to the team, but that role will be delegated. I think that generally, there are more minor conflicts that can arise, but I think as long as those roles are shared, there is transparency within the team about what those conflicts are, so that we can manage them, rather than just like keeping things a secret and like not having that communication. That's probably.
And I think everyone agrees, as we've constantly hopped on about, that our duty to the paper and our duty to students is foremost, and our personal relationships with activists sort of are secondary.
Yeah.
But I think they're still really important, and sort of speaks to like what I answered before, and that I think so much of like activists deep down respect and appreciate the importance Oni has in reporting on things, and so long as the gossip isn't trivial or like, you know, picking apart something about them that's like interpersonal or private, I think that largely that is the role of Oni, and that's something they respect. So I don't think it's something that would destroy relationships with these activists. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Last few questions. So we're finally there. It's we have missed the housing rally. Okay, so it's very possible that there'll be a federal election called in 2024. If this happens, how would you approach your reporting?
Well, I think that would depend on, you know, exactly what that election is going to look like. I mean, I guess, like, I would be personally very excited to cover something like that. And so I think in terms of what we've just been talking about, obviously it would be, you know, the two-party election. So a key part of that would be holding both parties to account, and kind of putting into practice the conflict of interest stuff we've just been talking about. I guess also part of that would be covering like events and concerns that students may have, or that they're you know, protesting about or holding events about, that are falling outside mainstream media and which are challenging both parties on their policies and which deserve a place in our paper. So it would be kind of like a critical stance on kind of the two-party system and the established mainstream, and then also a platforming of things that are happening outside the mainstream.
Definitely. That's great.
Yeah.
Would you endorse a party?
No.
Yeah, unlikely not. No. I think that's obviously a discussion we have later,
Yeah,
but I imagine not, because I think it's never in students' interest to endorse one party fully. I think it's important, to be critical of, obviously, like, we might lean towards one party more than the other if one party is the Liberals, but I think that we'll just have, like, it's important to criticise, like, aspects of that.
It's not on his role to endorse.
Yeah, that's true, actually.
To endorse a political party.
Cool. You say you'll advocate for First Nations justice on the university's unceded Gadigal land. Materially, what does that look like to your ticket?
So I guess that, from my perspective, comes down to engagement with First Nations activists, both on and off campus, and also great protest coverage around what's happening in Sydney. So Invasion Day rallies happen every year, more kind of, more speak outs that are called like at increments during the year. That coverage is really important. But I guess also engagement with the First Nations Collective, which happens in the Autonomous Edition, and also the Gadigal Centre is a really great point of contact.
I agree, engagement with First Nations writers and students on campus.
A few of the key issues you see as affecting First Nations students on campus.
I think a lot of them intersect with class.
I also think, obviously, like, we're dealing with the consequences of the Voice to Parliament referendum and how that influences and, like, impacts on Indigenous students and, like, potentially, like, God forbid, if, like, Peter Dunnan does something, that sort of thing. And I think, obviously, it hasn't been, like, I can't speak to this personally, but I know that a lot of Indigenous students and people have spoken about how the Voice to Parliament referendum has taken a big, like, mental and emotional toll, as anything does when you platform a specific minority and they're scrutinised with a lot of misinformation.
Within a colony, within an ongoing colonial
exactly.
project.
So I think that prioritising that and, like, prioritising, like, truth-telling and storytelling from First Nations writers, because I think that would be a big issue. And then obviously, as you said, it intersects with so many other issues on campus and like with other, like, identities that they might have and
I think
hold.
Also universities, like the changing nature of university policy, particularly in kind of what we're seeing in the aftermath of the NTU bargaining agreement, and also changes to, you know, what the university was looking at, how they were going to define if students were Indigenous.
And also, like, linking to what we were saying before about Indigenous, like, the amount of Indigenous roles, whether, like, I know that like First Nations staff at uni have a worse ratio of fixed to casual
Yeah.
roles. So just show like a lot of impacts of like poor staff conditions are multiplied or worsened
Yeah.
for First Nations people
Just
due to.
discriminatory policy
Yeah.
that is happening on campus. that
And
is
so I
to
think
call out.
that obviously those staff conditions impact students as well, both
Yeah.
First Nations and non-Indigenous students. So I think reporting on all of that is all very important.
Alright, last question. Flirt for Honi. There's no sort of, well, the original question said why students should vote for you, but this is an uncontested election. So I guess what can students expect from you? Can you summarise your commitments to the student body? Essentially, what do students have to look forward to in 2024?
I think students have a flirty and fun paper to look forward
Yeah.
to in 2024.
I think it's good to, we'll lift the mood and the spirit because there's
Yeah.
a lot of important news that we'll cover. We want to cover events. We want to make sure all students are heard and that marginalised student voices are platformed
Yeah,
and
and
that
the
every
hard
student feels
topics.
safe
Yeah.
and those hard topics. But we also want it to be really fun paper.
Yeah.
I first got involved through Honi in a very fun way, and I was just writing some thoughts I had on
Yeah.
animals, and then it was through that then I was more able to find my news voice, my investigative
Yeah.
voice, and I'm sure that's the same for many people.
Yeah.
So we want to be fun,
We want
welcoming.
people to keep coming back.
A love of studio. I think the
Yeah,
word studio
studio.
really wraps it up.
Yeah.
And I think any sort of events we want them to be big and fun and
Yeah.
forward and
And
involving
forward.
many people.
Yes.